with the national campaign now under full swing, many Americans are beginning to tune into the presidential race. I think probably the debate was evidence of that. And they're also tuning into Senate races, to House races, to local races. And in addition to the matchup between President Biden and Donald Trump, you also are aware that 1/3 of the U.S. Senate is going to be on the ballot in November, along with all 435 House races. And then in addition to that, there are several states that have some key referendums. There are constitutional amendments. And so as the November election draws near, we are watching an increase of claims of Christian nationalism and the like. This type of stuff is already being leveled toward evangelical Christians. So how do we need to be responding to all these arguments? And what is the proper Christian approach to government? Well, to discuss these questions and more, I'm honored to be joined by our weekly Worldview segment personality, David Closson. He's the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview here at FRC. David, always great to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Always a joy, Jody. Thank you.
All right, well, let's jump into this. There's so much talk about Christian nationalism these days. Let's begin with, what do we mean by Christian nationalism? This has become certainly a favorite buzzword on the left, so let's begin with a definition.
Well, and Jody, I think that's where the rub is, because there really actually is no agreed upon definition. Now, some people, when they use the term Christian nationalism, they simply mean that they're a patriot, they love their country, and they believe that Christian morality and Christian ethics should have influence in this nation. And that's really what they mean when they use the term Christian nationalism. There are others, though, Jody, who, when they say Christian nationalism, by that they really have actually kind of conflated their Christian identity with their American identity. They kind of see them as one and the same. Kind of on the kind of far right, so to speak, there would be those who actually would argue, this is a Christian nation. Because it's a Christian nation, we need to kind of impose a theocracy. We should impose, the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. And so that, I think that's the rub, Jody, is that there are so many different definitions that are out there. Now, I think what's important, though, and again, academics love to talk about these things. There's blogs and, all sorts of articles that have been written on this trying to define it. But why this actually matters for your everyday, regular person is that this term Christian nationalism has been weaponized by the left. I'm thinking of figures like Bill Maher and others who are kind of using Christian nationalism, that phrase, kind of as a scaremongering technique to really paint a broad brush over any evangelical, any Christian for that matter, that believes their faith has a public dimension to it, that they should vote on the life issue or religious liberty because the Bible gives us guidance on that. And so there's those on the left who've kind of weaponized this the same way other phrases, the right wing, the religious right. This really, again, is just a term I think that a lot of people have weaponized. And so, again, I think the academics are going to continue to talk about it. I think for the regular, everyday person, we need to realize that this is being weaponized against people like you and me that just believe that Christians should be engaged with the political process.
Yeah, it certainly has been majorly not only nationalized but weaponized. And it's presented to be such a negative. It's like the MAGA Republicans, the radical Republicans, the threats to democracy. All these kinds of things are wrapped up together. Let me kind of take this a step further with you, David. The recent discussions, if we will, about the new law in Louisiana requiring the posting of the Ten Commandments in classrooms. And then we had on just with us yesterday, Oklahoma's top education official, where they are now, they've pushed out a memo requiring every Oklahoma school to incorporate the Bible as instructional support, as part of the teaching for students in grades 5 through 12. The left, obviously not surprisingly, but they're branding these as efforts as also being part of what they claim as Christian nationalism. So what's your take on the left's reaction to these efforts, particularly considering how they are so ready to argue in favor of injecting radical LGBT ideology and much more into the classrooms, but they just don't want the Bible in any shape, form, or fashion.
Yeah, Jody, let me answer this question as kind of the convictional Baptist that I am. Baptists historically have been in favor of the separation of church and state. My Baptist forebears, not too far from where I am right now in Virginia, were not allowed to preach. They were not allowed to pastor local churches because of the state church. And so again, as a Baptist, I'm all in favor of the separation of church and state. I'm not in favor, though, of the separation of morality and government. By the way, Jody, and you know this, that phrase, separation of church and state, was a phrase coined in a letter in 1802 to the Danbury Baptist Association by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson by no means was saying that the state should have no influence from the church or from religion, but he did say the state can become inherently tyrannical and that the church should be protected from an overreaching state. But I think what's so interesting about this debate from Louisiana is they are not mandating a state religion. They are not trying to violate the Establishment Clause. Even in the legislation that was passed in Louisiana, it actually requires simply a preamble above the Ten Commandments that simply says, hey, the Ten Commandments are have played a prominent part of American public education for about 300 years. And so just appreciating the Judeo-Christian heritage, I think that's a fine thing to do. And I think it's an important thing to do. And to your point, Jody, I was actually speaking last week to a religion and politics class, secular university, and the students actually pushed me on this. Aren't you just trying to be a theocrat and how legislating your morality? And the answer I gave them, Jody, is this: there is no such thing as a naked public square. All legislation is imposing someone's morality. And you might be offended with the Ten Commandments in a classroom, but you're not offended with the rainbow flag in the New York City public school. And so I think someone's worldview is always being introduced into the public square. And I think as Christians, we should be absolutely in favor of the Ten Commandments, which is the basis of so much of our history. And I do think this is much to do about nothing but as far as the left's outrage. But then again, Jody, we've become accustomed to this.
Yeah, but you're exactly right. I mean, it's not like this is something new that all of a sudden, let's put the Ten Commandments in the courthouse or in the schools or utilize the Bible. This is what we have done in our country from its founding, from its very beginning. And what we're trying to do is come back to some of those national principles that served us exceedingly well for generations. And it's only as we have departed from those things that we have seen the continual collapse, not only of morality, but so many other major principles in our country, and including freedom. But the left now is using this terminology of Christian nationalism. I think additionally, from what we're talking about, they're also using it now to try to dissuade Christians from even getting out and engaging in politics, even to the tune of not even voting. And last week, you and I, when we were talking, we talked a little bit about a few theological principles that undergird Christian political engagement. And you mentioned stewardship and love of neighbor as a couple of things that as reasons for why Christians should engage. Can you develop those a little bit further? Are there some other principles or reasons that Christians should also engage in politics?
Yeah, just briefly, Jody, I do think those are helpful principles. Can you really say you love your neighbor in a comprehensive way if you're not engaged in the public square where so many decisions are made that directly impact the welfare of your neighbor? And I do think stewardship as well. We're called to be stewards of our time and our resources, but those of us who live in a constitutional republic are also called to be stewards of our vote. Another verse, though, to kind of add on to that would be Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7. The people of Israel, because of their disobedience and sin, they're being led into Babylonian exile. And what does the prophet say? He says, seek the welfare of the city, because in its welfare you will find your welfare. And so we have other examples. Think about Joseph and Daniel. There are all sorts of examples throughout the Bible where people are engaging. in the political process, engaging in government. Government is not something that's inherently dirty, Jody. Romans 11 says God always has a remnant. And my goodness, living in D.C. now for the last 5 years, I'm so encouraged by the good, godly men and women who are at all levels of government. And so you're right, Jody. I think this idea that we should, in the church, just do evangelism but not politics, that's a term that Wayne Grudem famously articulated as a paradigm that a lot of Christians are tempted to fall into. No, we do evangelism first and foremost, but we also engage this political process because we love our neighbors and we love our friends.
And I might add, because God instituted politics and government. This is not a man-made thing. God created the family, He created the church, and He created government. And for us to say we're going to engage 2 out of 3, that in itself is missing the mark that God has laid out for us. It's something else, David, that you have talked about before. In fact, you've even written about in FRC's Biblical Worldview series, is this whole idea that there are certainly some issues that the Bible speaks really clearly about, life, for example. But there are some other issues that the Bible doesn't directly address, and yet the principles are still there as guidelines. What are some of these issues that come to your mind?
Yeah, I think most people, Jody, are familiar with the idea of triage. You go to a hospital and obviously, the gunshot victim gets treated before the person with the scraped knee. Like there's a priority of the issues. And I think for Christians engaging in the political process, we need to look at the Bible and what are issues that are really clearly articulated. I think unfortunately some Christian leaders, well-meaning Christian leaders, have kind of said, have written in a way that, God has a position on everything. There's a Christian position on a capital gains tax or a Christian position on emission levels or something like that. And I think that's not helpful. What is helpful, though, is looking at God's Word and what are the issues that there's a thus saith the Lord. And one of those issues, the reason I talk about it so much, is the life issue, Jody. We have Psalm 139. We have Luke 1. Issues related to the family. We have Genesis 1 and 2, Ephesians 5. Issues related to sexuality. We have Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 6:9, 1 Timothy 1:10. And so just general guidance, where the Bible speaks and where the Bible is the most clear and the most emphatic, I think that's where we need to be the most clear and emphatic as we articulate principles and fight for policies that are congruent with what the Bible actually teaches.
All right, here's one that I hear a lot. I'm sure you do as well. But there's a lot of, this really come about, I highlighted, I guess it's 2016, but there's so many people out there, even some prominent individuals, who would say something to the effect that when you have 2 imperfect candidates, choose neither. Okay, or maybe when faced with 2 evils, choose neither. So, what's your response to this argument? Can a Christian choose the lesser of 2 evils when it comes to politics? I mean, after all, no one's perfect.
You're right, Jody. No one is perfect. I think it was Augustine who famously kind of articulated that in a kind of a different context. But I remember I was in seminary, Jody, in 2016, and someone I greatly admired kind of made that argument, particularly in the context of the 2016 election. Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, when faced with, the argument was when faced with 2 options that are not desirable, choose neither. And, I had to think about that, Jody, and realized unless Jesus Christ is on the ballot, we're always choosing between the lesser of 2 evils, whether we're voting for president or county dog catcher. We're always going to be voting for the lesser of 2 evils, or the lesser of perfect candidates or options. And that's where we have to do the hard work of thinking and looking at policy positions, looking at the scripture, looking at where candidates stand, looking at things like the party platform. And so, again, we can't check our minds at the door when we engage as Christians in the political process. We need to do all of these things. And honestly, that's one of the reasons the Center for Biblical Worldview was founded a few years ago, is to come alongside pastors and parents and Christian people to think about these issues together and try to think as faithfully and biblically as possible.
All right, just a few seconds left. You brought it up right there, and I think that's a great way to end. Where can people go to find out more about FRC's Center for Biblical Worldview?
Absolutely, Jody. frc.org/worldview. People can find all of our resources at frc.org/worldview.
David Closson, always great to have you on this segment discussing the news from a biblical worldview perspective. Thank you so much for joining us today, and happy 4th to you.
Happy 4th. God bless, Jody.